And then once you finish doing that, you can go ahead and grab your Bibles and open to Genesis chapter 2. We're going to look at two verses. At least we're going to start with two verses. That's verse 24 and 25 this morning. So we are in our third week of our series entitled Making Sense of Our Sexuality. And so we've been walking through these weeks and talking about the subject that makes most of us uncomfortable, and it's the topic that many times the church never really deals with honestly. And so we know because of the culture we live in and because of really, I think, the crisis within the church, we need to have an honest conversation about sexuality. So a couple weeks ago, if you weren't here, to kind of catch you up a little bit, we talked about the foundation of our sexuality and the context that God created, which we'll revisit a little bit this morning. And then last week, we talked about the confusion in our sexuality. So we talked about homosexuality, and we talked about how we navigate sexual sin in our lives and how we respond to people navigating that in their lives with compassion and understanding as Jesus did. And so then today, we're going to talk about the corruption of our sexuality. And we'll talk a little bit about how we take this beautiful thing that God has given to us, and I've said this each week, and that is sex is good because sex is from God. But we have a tendency to take what God gives us and we think somehow we can do it better. So we try to improve on it, we try to change it, we end up corrupting it, and we end up making it something that God never wanted it to be in our lives, which is a place of pain or confusion or frustration or disappointment. And so this morning we want to talk about that. As I've mentioned each week, definitely today too, a PG-13 message for sure. So if you have younger kids under the age of 13 and they're not in their classes yet, please take them now because, again, I don't want to explain what I'm going to explain to your kids. I want you to explain to your kids what we're going to talk about this morning because it's extremely important. Remember kind of the tension of what we're in sometimes when we don't take the time to talk about this. We go to one of two extremes. We go to the prudish side, which is I don't have any idea about sexuality or sex or anything like that because in my household it was a place of shame and embarrassment, so we didn't talk about it. Or you go to the other extreme, which is I was never given any categories of how to handle it, so I become promiscuous. I try to figure it out on my own, and then I find myself in trouble and not understanding how to navigate the challenges I've created. We want to make sure that we have a balanced conversation about sexuality because it's something that all of us have to deal with as being humans in our life. And so this morning we're going to talk about what happens over time sometimes in our own understanding of our sexuality and how it gets twisted and corrupted. And it's something that happens slowly in our own minds and in the culture we live in. It kind of saturates who we are. One of the houses that we lived in when we moved in, the people who obviously lived there before us wanted to have privacy from the neighbors. So they planted, I think they were some kind of a spruce. I'm not quite sure the exact tree, but anyway, they lined the property, really tall vertical trees, and so there was kind of this wall between us and our neighbors. But when we first moved into the house, I remember looking at one of the like the first tree in the row had this little section, it was maybe like that big, that just kind of was dead. The rest of it was green and tall, and all the other trees were, and it created this barrier. And I remember just kind of noting that, but not really thinking anything of that. And after the weeks went on, that little brown patch on the tree started to get bigger, and it started to stretch up and down the trunk of the tree. And then before I knew it, it was like a couple months went by, and that tree was completely dead. I mean, and it was next to all these other trees that were alive, and we were in Oregon, so it got enough water, and so there was plenty for it to grow. And so as I watched that was strange. And so I remember when that died, I pulled that tree out, thinking, well, you don't need a dead tree there. And so then as I pulled that tree out, I realized that as it was touching the next tree, that tree where the other tree was touching was also brown. And then I watched over the next week how that tree started to turn brown, and then the next tree started to turn brown, and before you know it, almost all the way down the line. And what we obviously didn't know, I'm not an arborist, so I don't understand trees very well, the first tree was diseased, and because it was next to the other tree, that tree became diseased, and then before you know it, it influenced the entire line of trees that we had to pull out because they all died. And sometimes we don't realize in our understanding of sexuality, there's something that happens that gets skewed or corrupted in our understanding. And it's this little area that doesn't bring life like sex is supposed to bring in our culture. The word is used, para, Hebrew, in Genesis 1 and 2, that God says, be fruitful and multiply. He says, flourish. And this is in the context of sex. And he's saying this is part of human flourishing. It should be a good thing, but somehow it gets corrupted. And then what happens is it begins to poison every aspect of our sexuality. And then it reaches outside that and begins to corrupt other things outside our sexuality. That's why this morning as we talk about what we're going to talk about, I want to make sure that this what we're going to talk about and the tone of what we're going to talk about can somehow feel like, oh man, I feel horrible because I'm struggling in that area and I don't think I can even break free from it. And everybody's looking at me because everybody knows I have that issue and I feel so uncomfortable. You don't have to raise your hand if that's you because that's all of us. But I want you to hear something. What the enemy loves to do when we talk about things that we're struggling with is he loves to turn up the shame factor on us. He wants the noise in our head to kind of blurt out what God is trying to say to us about something important in our life. Because God doesn't come to bring condemnation and judgment. He comes to bring grace, forgiveness, and healing in our lives. And that's the voice that we need to hear this morning when we talk about some areas that can be difficult to talk about. But before we talk about some of the specific ways that we've kind of corrupted our understanding of sexuality, I want to start kind of again with the context that God's created us to understand healthy sexual intimacy, which is a little bit of a review from a couple weeks ago, but I think it's important. We have to start there because it's starting there that helps us to understand again, why has God given us this thing called sex and why is it actually good? So 3 things I want to highlight are out of Genesis chapter 2. Let me read verses 24 and 25. Says that that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and yet they felt no shame. So in those couple verses, there's this context that God's outlining for all of us to understand of what healthy sexuality looks like, what it's supposed to look like in this context between a husband and a wife, in the context of this thing called marriage. So I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of what that means. So the context of our sexuality, the way it was originally intended, the first thing is this. It comes in the context of monogamy. And that means only for you with your spouse. That's what you're saying. Monogamy meaning that it's just a husband and a wife. It's not 3 people. It's not 5 people. It's not 10 people. It's monogamous. It's just 2 people together. That's the way that God originally intended. It says that in verse 24, they became one flesh. There's this deep connection that's a direct reference to sexual intimacy within the context of marriage, where there is this one flesh reality, which is monogamous. Now, some people will say, well, I read the Bible, and there's polygamy all over the Old Testament. And there is. But you have to understand, when you read through the Scriptures, just because something is included in the Scriptures and God doesn't necessarily come right out and condemn it, doesn't necessarily mean that he's condoning it. Because what he does is he doesn't say, okay, here's all the reasons of why this is wrong, but usually what God does is says this is the right thing, and everything else that falls outside the context of this misses the mark of what I purpose for your life. The same thing is true with marriage being monogamous. It's so important. And the reason why is that this monogamy is that it's something that is given to a husband and a wife that is not intended to be shared with anybody else. It can't be. And sometimes we think that it's okay, and it can be. And remember, as I'm talking about this already, as I'm going to go into this, I know the shame factor in many is kind of going up. Listen, God redeems our broken sexuality. And so don't hear shame and guilt and condemnation. Hear that there's hope for me, that even though I'm dealing with this, God can bring me to a place of freedom and wholeness in my life. And I've shared this before, and I've shared this with Courtney and Jordan, especially with teenagers, and they're growing up and they're navigating this in their life, is that this thing called monogamy is so important because God has given you a thing called virginity that he gave to you as a gift to give to one person in your life. It is your spouse. That's what he gave it for. And I use the analogy because for me, when I was growing up, Tonka trucks were a big thing. Like this was like before like the wave of electronics, you know. But like Tonkas were like when I was really young, like everybody had like a big Tonka truck that you could push around and get it dirty and everything. And so if I got invited to a birthday party and I wanted to buy like the best gift for my friend, I would buy a Tonka truck. Now, if I bought a friend a Tonka truck and his birthday was a week away, and then I brought it home and I wrapped it up and set it there waiting for the birthday to come, but then the next day after I bought it, one of my other friends comes over, and he really likes Tonka trucks. And I know what I just bought my other friend, and I know what's in that package. And I think to myself, man, it would be really fun to play with this friend with the Tonka truck. So let's just unwrap it, and we'll play with it a little bit. It won't get messed up. I'll put it back in the package. I'll rewrap it, and my friend will never know. He'll think it's new. So my other friend comes over, we unwrap it, we play with it for a little while. It gets a little dirty, but a little water takes it off. It looks still pretty new, so I put it back in the box. It looks like it'll be okay. Put it back on the shelf, and I wait. Then the next day comes, and another friend comes over, and he likes Tonka trucks too. Like, man, I did it once, I could do it again. So I unwrap it, and we play again, but this time there's a big old scuff on the side of it. And I can't get the scuff off. It's not mud, it's like scratched. But I'd really try real hard, but I think, it'll be okay. So I stick it back in the box, but I reverse it so that the scratch is on the other side, so no one will know, and I wrap it back up, and I set it on the shelf. And then the third day, another friend comes over, and he likes Tonka trucks. And I'm like, I can't, I said yes to the first two. I can't say no to the third guy, right? So we unwrap it. This time, one of the wheels falls off. So I try to figure out, there is no other side to go to. So I got a scratch on one side and a wheel falling off the other side. So I shove it back in the box, and I wrap it up, and I think, I hope he doesn't know. And then I show up to the party. What do you think he's going to do when he opens it? He's going to go, wow, thanks for the brand new Tonka truck. No, he's going to go, what happened? And then I'm left to explain. Now, hear me. I don't say that to put guilt or shame on anyone, but you need to understand this is the same with our virginity. This is what God gives. Now, hear this. If you've given that away already, God can redeem that in your life, and even in the relationship that you may be in right now where you gave it away before the context of marriage. God can redeem those things to make it right, because it's a gift that God wants you to give, and he wants you to give it in the way he intended. So the first thing to understand is there's this concept of monogamy. It's just only for you, nobody else. Nobody else gets it. Second thing, look at verse 25. The context of our sexuality is not only monogamy, it's intimacy. This is only with you. So it says in verse 25, Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. This is such a powerful picture of what God intends for marriage, especially in the context of our healthy sexuality with our spouse. So understand this. So Adam and Eve, this is before sin enters the equation. We don't like to talk about this. They were totally naked. I mean, and clothes weren't even a part of the dialogue. They didn't have Kohl's down the street that they could go pick up something. They didn't have clothes. Why? And they didn't need clothes. Why did they not need clothes? Because there was no shame. There was nothing to hide. And at this point in the story, from what we can pick up, there were no other people. So there are no other people to hide from. It's just Adam and Eve by themselves, naked without shame, which is the definition of intimacy. To be fully known and to fully know somebody else. And that is given for a husband and a wife only to share with each other. And the only way you can experience true intimacy is when that is only expressed in the context of your relationship with your spouse, because the moment you share that with somebody else is the moment you lose intimacy. And so many times we strive for intimacy, but the problem is when we strive for intimacy, we want to have it with a bunch of different people, and you can't. Because what happens is the uniqueness of what you have in the context of a husband and wife in marriage, when you step outside of that, what was special and what makes it special is it's absolutely unique with nobody else. Then if it comes with somebody else, it loses its specialness. It's like, the person who really needs to be loved by people, and because of that, they go over the top to make sure everybody likes them, and they always tell everybody, you're my favorite. You're my favorite friend. You're my favorite employer. You're my favorite this. And you hear them in a conversation saying something like, you're my favorite friend. 5 minutes later, over here, I'm saying another person, you're my favorite friend. How does that make you feel? Well, I thought I was your favorite. No, there's like 15 other favorites too. So what does it do? It takes what's unique and special and intimate, and it makes it worthless, because it's not something that's shared just between the two of you. It's actually shared with everybody. And that's what God's explained with this context of our sexuality, is that he's created it to have this level of intimacy. And the only way intimacy happens is when it's just between the two of you. It's a special thing that God gives to you that you don't share with anybody else, and it makes it absolutely unique. And then there's a third context for sexuality, and that is unity. That is only by you. Going back to verse 24, it says, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. This is really important. Part of the reality of sexual intimacy in marriage is that it is part of the process that separates us from our family of origin or from our parents and binds us to our spouse, which is an extremely important and healthy process. Because you don't have to raise your hands, but all of us know at one time or another when we got married, especially if you got married when you were younger, your parents always had some kind of reach into your relationship that created a little bit of tension of loyalty. You don't have to raise your hand, but all of us know how that works. So you're married now, but mom and dad still have an agenda for your life. Mom and dad still have an agenda for their holidays, for birthdays, for the traditions of your family. Part of the encounter of our sexual intimacy in marriage disconnects that bond with our parents and creates a bond and a loyalty with our spouse. It doesn't mean that we absolutely disregard our parents, but our loyalties shift to each other so that ultimately it isn't about what mom and dad want anymore. It's about what my spouse needs. Now, I haven't done a study on this, but I could guess to say from my experience as a pastor in counseling that not always, but there are times when if you're struggling in sexual intimacy in the early stages of your marriage, you also probably are struggling with boundaries with your parents because you haven't fully bonded yet. And you're still playing like, I don't want to disappoint my parents. And so you haven't fully bonded to your spouse yet. So there's this tension until finally you begin to express and experience true intimacy with your spouse. And there is this bond that's created, this unity that comes about in you. And because of that, there isn't a tension anymore. There isn't like, oh, I've got to, especially, I know this is typical, but guys, it's always the mother-in-law, right? It's like, oh, she's always butting her nose in. By the way, my mother-in-law's here and she's nothing like that, okay? So, but it's that kind of tension. Well, if there's healthy sexual intimacy in a relationship, that begins to even if the parents are trying to weave their way into your relationship, they can't get there. Why? Because you've left that, what birthed you into the world, and now you've bonded with the person that God's created you to be with. And because of that, now you have this unity. So I wanted to begin with this because that is the context that God created. And why is that important? I think what we're going to talk about in the next section here is really highlighting some of the areas where we've corrupted our sexuality. But why I start with that is because and I mentioned this earlier, we have a tendency to do is we want to know, God, give me all the do's and don'ts of sexuality. In fact, God mentioned everything that I shouldn't do so I know not to do it. But the Bible's not written that way. What God does is he holds up the standard and says, this is what I've created for you. This is what's good for you. This is what brings about flourishing. And so he says, if you focus on this, you don't have to worry about all of that. I heard a pastor explain it this way once. It's really good. He goes, if I brought 5 women up on the stage and I wanted to identify to you who my wife was, he goes, I wouldn't spend any time telling you why the first 4 weren't my wife. He goes, I would just explain to you why the one was my wife, and I would tell you the physical characteristics, her personality, so you would know who she is, not because by absence or by default, like, well, I guess it has to be her because it's not the other 4. God does the same thing. He holds up the standard and says, this is what it is. It's a good thing. It's what I want you to have. But because of that, we also have to address for us, especially in our culture, some of the things that maybe are points of corruption that have caused pain and confusion and frustration for us in our life. And so as I have been throughout this series, I'm going to be pretty frank and pretty honest about these things, but this is, I believe, is important for us to talk about. So the corruption of sexuality, this is not a comprehensive list, but I think general categories of areas where our mentality in our culture and even within the church has gotten skewed on our sexuality. So the first point of corruption in our sexuality is in the area of extramarital sex, which means a sexual encounter, whether as full as intercourse to the point where you know you're having sexual feelings towards someone and you engage physically, outside the context of a husband and wife in the context of marriage. Outside of that is extramarital. It's outside of that. There's a myth, and I will address some myths as we go through this today. The myth about extramarital sex is this: it's just sex. What does it matter what 2 consenting adults do? I've heard that so many times. What does it matter? And in other words, what's it going to hurt? Paul says this, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 18 through 20. He says, flee sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You are bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. What is Paul saying? See, the act of sexual sin, of brokenness or corruption or sexuality, is more than just me going and robbing a bank. Because it is something that not only am I using my body to engage in, but I'm also inflicting it upon myself. About my own. The body, and especially the sexual act, is the most personal, intimate thing that any human being can have. So that's why Paul writes, listen, all other sins are outside the body, but sexual sin, it's against yourself. It's very, very personal, and that's why it's important that when we go outside this context of what God's created, we realize that it is hurting us, and it is hurting other people. It isn't just okay as long as it's 2 consenting adults, because we're missing what God's purposed. There's a word that Paul uses, the word he uses for sexual immorality is the word porneia, which is the same root word where we get pornography, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's any sexual activity outside the context of marriage. This is important. Why? Because whether you know it or not, God has created and designed you specifically to bond with your spouse, and he has actually built that into you down to the hormonal level, that God has created you that way. There's actually in the act, the sexual act, and in the closeness and intimacy physically, it's higher in women, but it's also true in men. There's actually a hormone that is released called oxytocin. And that is the same hormone that women release when they're breastfeeding, and that's why I never get between a baby and her mom, because she'll kill you. Because there's a bond. There's skin to skin releases this hormone, and it's higher levels in women, but it's in men as well. So when you are in a sexual encounter with somebody, there is this bonding hormone released between the two of you that whether you want to or not, you are now bonded to each other. It's a chemical thing. It's down to the physiological of who we are. So we're bonded with each other. And that's why when we choose to have multiple sexual partners, whether we want to or not, we are always bonding ourselves to individuals. We're leaving a piece of who we are behind every time. And so when we try to move forward, there's something that tends to, even if it's an abusive relationship, it tends to pull us back. Because what God had intended in the context of marriage is that you would be bound to your spouse, which is kind of, people call it the faithfulness hormone. That's what it is. It bonds you to your spouse. So that you're not drawn to anybody else, you're just drawn to your spouse. Why? Because God's created that almost that chemical reaction between the two of you. And that's why extramarital sex can be so destructive to our lives, because we want to move on, but we can't because we're bound to people. And so then when it happens over and over and over again, what ends up happening is we become numb. We struggle because we know that there's a part of us that's going to be left behind. And so for some, you don't even know how to engage sexually when you get married, because there's this sense that I've already bonded with so many other people, I can't bond with my spouse. But you know, God's grace can even touch down to the chemical level of who we are, can bring healing and freedom for that and forgiveness in our lives for those things. So the first way that we kind of corrupt what God's intended is through extramarital sex. Second thing, by the way, these don't get any easier, is pornography. Pornography, and here's the myth of pornography. It's just images, it's just video, it doesn't hurt anyone. That's the mentality. But there's a problem with that. Jesus said in Matthew 5:28, he says, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." What is Jesus saying? The core of our sin is not here. The core of our sin is here and here. It's in our head and in our heart. It's the intent that's there. The physical reality is just the outflow of what's already buried inside of us. And what pornography does is it allows us to connect with a screen or an image or a picture, and we in our minds engage fully with what's going on, and it creates this bond. And what it does ultimately is it goes to the core of our sin already, which is we're already committing sin in our hearts because of what's going on in our minds and what we're seeing through our eyes. And so for us, that means that to get down to that level means that pornography at its core, for those who, if you're not married, it's sexual immorality. And if you are married, it's adultery. Because you're creating a bond with somebody else that isn't your spouse. And you think, well, it's just images. And these are people that get paid good money to perform sex acts in video and to pose for pictures in magazines or on the internet. But you don't know the underside of the porn industry. It's one of the most destructive industries in our country. And there's a steady debris field of humanity coming out of the porn industry because of what happens within the context of sex that is abuse by nature. It isn't love. It isn't intimacy. It's nothing of what God created. And so therefore, it is very destructive in the lives of people. And sometimes we don't realize that. It's what's crazy. You know that porn is as addictive as heroin, which is one of the most addictive substances on the planet? It's that, and some who struggle that, you know the reality of what that looks like in your life. But it just doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt anybody. It's not really hurting me. Actually, it's hurting everybody. It's hurting you and your relationships, and it's hurting the person on the other end of that screen, or the other side of that screen. There's a gal named Shelley Lubin who just last few years came out of the porn industry. And she was a porn star for years. And she came out and she's been telling stories about stuff that is commonplace in the porn industry in terms of the abuse towards women. You know, there's been a rise in awareness of sex trafficking in our country. But at the same time, people have been ignoring that there is sexual abuse and bondage in the porn industry like you would never believe. That when a woman is on set and she's simply there to provide a service that can get on camera, there is little regard for her physical condition or the pain she experiences at the hand of somebody else. And Shelley told story after story of women who are literally in the middle of being raped on camera and are in tears, and they're told to suck it up for the camera. And the physical pain and the emotional pain that comes with that. It's what you're watching rape is what's happening in that context, even if it is for money. And so whether you think it or not, you are harming somebody on the other side of that picture, and you're harming yourself. But there's hope. We had 100 guys show up for Conquer a month and a half ago, and we have a handful of guys going through small groups. And if you are dealing with pornography, which, by the way, if you think you can manage pornography, you've already lost the battle. It will win every time. You need accountability and you need help. And part of that is Tuesday night, they're forming group 7 o'clock in room 2. They're forming new groups that will go on long-term accountability in this area for guys. Guys, if you're struggling with this, do not think you can win this one on your own. You can't. You need people's help to walk with you arm in arm without shame and honesty and transparency and accountability. Ladies, we're working on resources for you. I know there's a lot that are struggling in this area as well. But this is something we have to take seriously. Okay, ready? I told you it's not getting easier. Extramarital sex, pornography, and then a category that we'll just call virtual sex. And that is sexting, phone sex, online sex, basically electronic sex. And the myth on this one, again, it's the same kind of thing. It's safe, it's harmless. In fact, it's probably the safest sex there is out there because you can't get a sexually transmitted disease. It's all via screen. It's all just words. It doesn't really mean anything. It means a whole lot. See, what happens when we engage in sex not as an outflow of a loving marriage, but as a result of something that we want to benefit from, then what we're doing is we're tapping into the opposite of what marriage is. Marriage is based on covenant. And covenant is I make a commitment to you regardless of the circumstances that we will face together because I choose to love you and let my life be a benefit to you. That's covenant. That's what God does for us. Consumerism is the opposite. It says, I am committed to you as far as you will please me or make me feel good so I can continue to consume. And when sex becomes about consumerism, which basically says, I'm going to use you for my benefit. I'm going to use you for my own pleasure. Then what happens is the other person doesn't necessarily get the benefit, but here's the danger of consumerism. Eventually, consumerism causes us to move on to consume more. It's true. We don't think about other people. When consumerism kind of rides, all we can think about is what's in it for me, what's best for me. I don't care about the outcome. I don't care what it does to anybody else. Why? Because I'm just going to consume. I mean, sorry, I'm not trying to bag on one place, but why do we all shop at Walmart? Because it's cheap and we're consumers. Regardless if somebody in another nation is under slave labor in order to produce that product, as long as it's really cheap. I'm not saying that Walmart hires slaves to make products, okay? But what I'm saying is that's the concept of consumerism. I don't care what it takes to make this as long as it benefits me and benefits me that's cheap and convenient. The same thing is applied to our sexuality. When I start to think through my sexuality in terms of how I can consume it and how it can benefit me, regardless of what it does to somebody else, which is what sexting and virtual sex online does to people, and when that happens, then we've just become consumers. And what's crazy about consuming is that we become insatiable and we never, ever are satisfied. Never, ever. It always has to be more, and that's the same thing with pornography. Pornography, it's never enough. It always has to be greater or more intense or more twisted or whatever it is. It just keeps leading us on because it's not answering to what we're looking for. It takes us down a road that we don't want to go down to. And then there's two other things. The corruption of our sexuality also has to do with self-gratification, or the popular term we use is masturbation. And yes, I'm going to talk about this. You think, really, Pastor John, you're going to? Yes, I am. That's why I told you, PG-13. What's the myth around self-gratification? It's this. What's wrong with making myself feel good? Isn't it just discovering my body? Now, let me kind of give some broader context for this issue that so many people walk through and struggle with in their life, whether as an adolescent or even as an adult. That the extremes we can go to is that we can attach incredible guilt and shame and judgment on someone who's navigating and struggling in this in their area. Or we can go to the other extreme, which is, it's just discovering your body. It's okay. It's just a part of growing up. It's just a part of knowing who you are. Both of those are extremes, and both of those, I think, miss the mark. I think there's something in the innocence of adolescence and self-discovery that sometimes that occurs and self-gratification occurs. But for most people, it doesn't end there. It becomes a cycle in life that comes along with guilt and shame. And then if you're a Christian, it's the promise to God, I'm going to stop, and this time's the last time. And you swear by everything in your life only to repeat it 3 days later or a week later or whatever it might be. It's this cycle. And then if you come from the background where someone's basically told you, if you do that, you're going to go blind and go to hell. We've all heard that, right? Then now what? That's the worst thing possible, because now you're just backed into a corner with your brokenness and your addiction, and you have no hope because you can't talk about it. See, here's the reality of how we need to navigate this. Again, it's lifting up what God has intended for marriage and sexuality and pleasure in sex. Here's the deal. Listen, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, Paul says this: the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. What is Paul talking about? He's talking about that if you understand sexuality, you understand that you are given a sexual organ not for yourself. You were given it for your spouse. That's the reason. God has given it to you. You think, no, it's for me. No, it's not for you. It's for your spouse. And it's for mutual pleasure in the sexual encounter inside of marriage, and that's the way that God has designed it. And that is so important, because when we're with this, it's good when you're younger and you discover that you have a sex drive. That's healthy. You just have to wait for the right context. But what happens is when you're driven by that and it becomes addictive in its nature, then what happens is when you get into a relationship or you even get into marriage, what happens is you still think sex is about what pleases me. And then you're in trouble, because you realize that's not why God's given you a sexual organ. He's given it for you for the benefit of your spouse. And that's why Paul says, listen, the wife doesn't have rule over her body and the husband doesn't have rule over it. They both yield it to each other for their mutual benefit. And those who've been married for a while, you probably understand this and you get this, and it took me a while to figure this one out. The most important thing in a sexual encounter between a husband and a wife is when each person has the focus on the other person, not on themselves. It took me a while to figure out that the focus in our sexual encounter in marriage was for me not to think of how does it feel good to me, but what is the best thing for my wife. I'm a little slow. It took me a while to figure that out. When you finally figure that out, you figure out what Paul's talking about, you realize sex is the beautiful thing that God has given to you. Why? Because it isn't about your gratification. Because what happens if it is, it will always disappoint you. Always. Because it will never be enough. But if it is about how do I show love to my spouse, then it's fulfilling. Paul obviously was a single guy who knew what he was talking about. The only way a single guy who knows what he's talking about sex is if the Holy Spirit reveals it to him. And obviously that's what Paul learned from the Holy Spirit. And aren't we glad? I know it's really uncomfortable, and you guys are kind of chuckling because you're really nervous right now, and it's awkward. I know. Then there's one last thing, and then I want to take some time before the worship team comes up to kind of bring us to a conclusion. And that is, we also corrupt our sexuality in the area of fantasy. So our understanding of fantasy, again, it's this idea, is if it's all in my mind, it's not going to hurt anybody. You know, for guys, if a pretty lady walks by and I undress her with my eyes and I'm not hurting her, she doesn't even know, it's just me in my mind, it's just fantasy, it doesn't really hurt anybody. Yes, it does. It always does. See, the problem is the original sin, the origin of our sin is not in our hands, it's not in our physical bodies, it's in our hearts and our minds. And there are very few human beings who can fantasize in their minds and never, ever act out. It's nearly impossible. Eventually, you're going to need more than fantasy to fulfill what you think you need sexually. And so the more you fantasize about somebody else, the more you're going to be driven to eventually you're going to take action, because sin has this nature to it. It's never enough because it doesn't answer to what we are crying out for deep in our heart. To have a sense of satisfaction, fulfillment, sin can never deliver, but it's almost like drinking salt water. You think your thirst is being quenched, but you're dying inside, and you can never get enough. That's what sin does to us, and sexual sin really does that, and fantasy causes us to move closer and closer to action that we will regret. Nobody acted out physically, sexually, without having the thought first. It just didn't happen. It happened here and here first, and then it happened physically. So we have to be aware of that. And there's a couple things I wanted to share this, and then we'll start to wrap up in a moment. I'll have the worship team come. But this is, I want you to understand again, what the tendency is in this message is to feel, I feel guilty, I feel shameful, I feel dirty, I feel wrong because Pastor John hit one of the things I'm dealing with. That's the enemy again. But I want you to understand, God's desire for us is not to be the great killjoy in the sky, not to be the legalistic, prudish God that sometimes we make him out to be, that doesn't want us to have fun, that only wants to create rules so that he can be in control. That's the knock people have on God. That is so far from the truth of who he is. But God knows humanity because God created humanity. He also created a context in which we can flourish. He said, listen, this is how I've created you, how I've wired you, how I've designed you, and now I've given you this context, and the context what we've talked about is marriage, to experience the fullness of how I've created this good thing called sex to be, and we think, you're just being limited. You're just being controlling. You're just not you don't want us to have any fun, and that is so opposite from the truth. And I've shared this illustration before, but it's a little ridiculous, but I think you can capture the concept. Let's say there's a fish swimming around in a lake, and one day he comes up with this great idea. He wants to be free. And he's come to the conclusion that living in the lake has been restrictive and controlling, and he has been bound up, and he wants to be free, and he needs to get out of the lake in order to be free. So one day he gets up the courage and he says to himself, I am no longer going to be limited by this lake. I am going to jump out of the lake onto dry ground. I'm going to go hiking and running and doing all the things that non-fish do. And so he gets the courage and he swims hard and he flies out of the water and he hits the beach. And then what happens? He starts flipping around, realizing, I can't swim. And then he starts realizing, I can't breathe. And then before he knows it, what happens? He's dead. But he was free, wasn't he? No, he wasn't. Where was he free? He was free in the context of the lake. But the moment he got outside the context, what entered the equation was death. And see, that's sin as a whole, is that God says, listen, here's the context. I've created you to flourish as a human being, to be everything I created you to be, because I'm the designer, I'm the creator, I know what's best for you. But we say, no thanks. I'm going to go be free. I'm going to go do it my way. And God says, no. But then God's love is so great that even when we stick our noses up in his face and mock him and say, we're going to do it our way, he still sends his son to die on the cross for us. Even in our arrogance and our rebellion, he still loves us and says, no, there's a better way. And I'm going to make a way for you to be redeemed, not only in your whole life, but I'm going to make a way for you to be redeemed in your sexuality so it's healthy and it's right. And it's what I created for you. I'm going to ask the worship team if they would come join me. And I'm going to ask you if you would just do something simple. If you would just bow your heads, close your eyes. And the reason I'm having you do that, I want you to capture a response to what I believe God is saying to us today. In fact, those who are a part of prayer teams, you can go ahead and position yourself on the sides and in the back. So as we've done each week, as we've walked through this, because I know the nature of the sensitivity of what we walk through in this area of sexuality and how much shame can be a part of that and how much embarrassment can be attached. I want you to know that in a moment we're going to conclude with some worship together, but there's going to be teams of people around the room on the sides and the back that are going to be available just to pray with you. If it's a point where you need to come and you just need to confess something that you know that you're dealing with, they're going to be there. It's a safe environment. And I know the tendency will be, I don't want to stand up because then everybody's going to know my stuff. You mean everyone's going to know you're a sinner just like them? We're all sinners. But what I want to encourage you to do, if you can't muster up the courage to walk to somebody, I ask that you would at least turn to the person who's sitting next to you and say, can you pray for me? I'm dealing with this. If you came with a friend or someone you could trust, you need to get it out. If it's the area of pornography or sexual relationships outside the context of marriage or fantasy or self-gratification or whatever it might be that you know that you're engaged in, and you know that today, by God's grace and his mercy and compassion, he's reaching into your soul right now and he's saying, I have a better way. I have a context I've created for you and I want you to live in it. I want you to flourish. And you know he's speaking that to you today, then I'm going to encourage you that one of the things you have to do, forgiveness is always preceded by confession. Because confession acknowledges that the way that we've been living is not the way God wants for us. And in turning, that's what the Bible calls repentance, that we turn from the way that we used to live, acknowledging it's not the way God wants for us, but then we get to turn to the way he wants us to live. And you can do that today. You can experience that redemption and freedom in this area. But I want you to capture this picture before we do that together. As we were worshiping together in first service, the Lord gave me a very vivid picture that I feel applies to each one of us. So picture with me, this was my experience, but I want you to picture yourself doing this. So I'm standing on a seashore, facing the ocean. And as I'm facing the ocean, I see in the distance there's a wave that it's building. And as it's building, I realize it's building rapidly and it's building fast and it's higher and higher. And I'm noticing that the tide is receding, and I realized it begins to kind of click in my brain. I'm witnessing a tsunami and I'm standing on the beach. And as the waters recede and the wave starts to build, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I realize as I'm standing there, there is nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide. There's no place to climb up high enough. I'm standing there and I realize I'm dead. And just as the wave reaches the shore and I'm standing probably 20 or 30 feet from it, and I look at it and it's higher than I can see, it's hundreds of feet tall, and I'm just resolved to the fact that my life is over. And I could see it suddenly in my vision from the right. Jesus steps in and he strikes the wave, this huge wave. And as he strikes the wave, it disintegrates into mist. And it's gone, and all I feel is this light mist on my face as I'm cowering, waiting to be crushed by this wave. And as I open my eyes and I'm standing there, the wave is gone, and only Jesus is left. I want you to see today that all of us stand in front of this huge wave called sin. It is the thing that is creeping up on us. It is the thing that is building up. It is the thing that causes us to no longer have hope that we can ever be different. And we're stuck and we believe that it is the end. And then Jesus comes along, and through his death on the cross, he strikes the wave of sin and vaporizes it in front of us. And so today, whatever it is that you have been walking through, whatever mountain or wave of sin that you face today, it is never too big. It is never too thick. It is never too strong for Jesus to strike and vaporize in front of us, because he is victorious. He said it is finished. But you and I have to walk in that. So today I'm going to encourage you. God is present. Jesus is here. His Spirit works in us. He is inviting us to say, listen, as he said to the woman who was caught in adultery, he said, after he said, neither do I condemn you, which means you're being forgiven right in this moment. Then he said, now go leave your life of sin. Why could he say that? Because he knew in just a short amount of time he would go to the cross and he would vaporize her sin. He would turn it into a mist. And he does that for us today, saying to you, now you can walk in courage, in freedom, in wholeness, in acceptance. Why? Because I vaporized your sin, but you still have to walk. So today's the day you walk. Today's the day you walk in freedom. You walk out of the darkness you've lived in into the light of Jesus to bring clarity and forgiveness and redemption in the area of our sexuality. Jesus, would you do that in us? As we give ourselves fully to you, would you do that in us? Would you meet us right here, right now, and touch the deepest areas of our brokenness and bring healing and wholeness to each one of us, Jesus, in your name.